Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, an author who never lets me down. This is my review of Nestlings by Nat Cassidy. I went on Goodreads earlier just to double check that I was right about the number of books that Nat Cassidy has published. And I realised when I did that I've given every book that I've read by him a 5-star rating. So this is the 4th of his books that I've finished, and I have loved each and every one of them. The other 3, for reference, were Mary, When the Wolf Comes Home and Rest Stop, all of which I've reviewed on the channel. He's just a fantastically good horror writer, and not just a good horror writer, a good writer full stop. His books are always entertaining, always moving, always completely gripping, and always inventive and imaginative. I think he's absolutely fantastic. There's only one novel that I haven't read by him, which is called, I think, Steal the Stars, and I believe it's like an adaptation of a podcast or something like that. So it's the first thing I think that he published. He published it before his kind of breakout novel Mary, and more recently he's published a few short stories, so I need to get my hands on those and read those as well. But Nestlings, which is the book he published after Mary, so a few years ago now, I think kind of 3 years ago, I liked it just as much as all of his other books, and he manages to do something slightly different with each of his novels. There are definitely things that are common in all 4 of them, but there are also things that are different about them in terms of their themes and tones and things like that. So I just think he's absolutely brilliant, and if you haven't read him yet, you should check him out. So let me tell you what Nestlings is about. So this is a novel set in New York, and it's a really New York book. I love the concept of New York. I've never been there, I may never go there, but it's a city that's so familiar to me from books and movies and TV shows and things like that. I always enjoy visiting it virtually. So set in New York, and it has a very New York feeling. And not only is it set in New York, it's set in one of those big imposing apartment buildings in New York. So think the one from Rosemary's Baby, for example. And there are other parallels between this book and Rosemary's Baby. So this big, like really dramatic building is where it's set, and the central couple in the book, he is a musician, and she is a voiceover artist. She does like reads audiobooks and things like that. They move into this apartment. They are they're not wealthy, and the building is a building that is mostly populated by wealthy people, but it has this thing where there is like a lottery, and every so often a less well-off family or couple or person gets chosen to get one of the apartments and be able to move into it. So they move into this apartment with their infant daughter, and it's pretty obvious from the start that there's some weird stuff going on, and I'm not going to get into it and spoil the plot for you, but it's reasonably obvious from fairly early on where this book is going. And despite the fact you kind of have a sense of what is going to happen, it still manages to surprise at times, and it never lets up on the tension. Despite you kind of knowing what's happening, you still want to keep reading more. And I really love the gradual reveal of what is really going on in this book. So they move into this building, and it's got this wonderful kind of creepy, weird atmosphere. Like the people who work in the building are slightly weird, some of the other inhabitants are slightly weird. It's just got this really rich atmosphere, but you've also got this kind of broader atmosphere of just New York as a place as well. So for example, their previous landlord, who's an absolutely appalling guy, is a character who kind of crops up throughout the book. And he's fantastically enjoyable to read. He's a really unpleasant racist guy, but enormously enjoyable to spend some time with as well, to have as a kind of counterpoint to the main characters in the book. And the 2 main characters are really well drawn as well. So they are Jewish, and, as is Nat Cassidy, and the wife is disabled, so she has suffered something. I won't tell you what it is because it's a slight spoiler, but she'd suffered something which has left her unable to use her legs, so she's in a wheelchair. And Nat Cassidy's depiction of her, of the situation she finds herself in and how she copes with that, I thought was really, really sensitively done. But it's never kind of it's never like overly sentimental or anything like that. It felt like a genuinely convincing portrayal of a person who finds themselves in that situation, a person who is in a wheelchair and is having to look after a young child as well. So it doesn't sugarcoat anything at all. And the other thing that's great about this book is just the relationship between the two central characters. Again, it's a difficult relationship. It frays at times. There is no sugarcoating of the fact that sometimes relationships can be difficult, sometimes marriages can be difficult, parenthood can be difficult, particularly when you have an infant. None of us, lots of people want to have babies, don't they? But when you actually have that baby, boy, is it a bit of a surprise. You don't imagine how you will ever manage to cope when you get as little sleep as you do when you have a young infant in the house. So all of that is really, really well done. But aside from that, great sense of place in terms of New York, and really good portrayal of characters who you really come to care about. You've also got this fantastic creepy stuff going on in the background, which is like sometimes just creepy, sometimes like really gross and over the top, but always interesting and entertaining. And I think, I was thinking about it, I think there are three things that make Nat Cassidy such a good writer. And as I've said, I think there are differences between the four of his books that I've read, but the thing that is true of all of them, or the things that are true of all of them, is firstly that his books are incredibly readable. There's something about his prose that it means it just kind of flows into my brain. And I love writers like that. My favourite writers, Stephen King and Ed McBain / Evan Hunter, they have that same talent that it feels like there's no barrier between you and the prose. There's nothing extraneous there. There's nothing additional there that you need to kind of process. You can just take the meaning from their words immediately. And as a result of that, A, you get more swept up in the book, but B, you get more emotionally involved with what's going on, because you kind of almost forget that you're reading. You're just experiencing the story. So really, really readable prose. Great pacing as well. His pacing is excellent. None of his books are too long, and they all hit the kind of beats of the plots being gradually revealed really, really perfectly. He just manages to do it again and again and again. I don't know how much time he spends like planning out how he's gonna tell the story that he's going to tell, but you really feel it. There's a perfection. I almost said there's kind of an almost clinical perfection to the way he writes, and that makes it sound like his writing is cold, and it isn't at all. But his books are, as well as being feeling kind of heartfelt, are incredibly well crafted, and that really comes over in his plotting and his pacing. And then the third thing is, as I've said, his characters are fantastic. They feel really fully rounded. They really do feel like real people, and that makes you care all the more about what is happening to them, and makes the books even more engrossing than they would be already. Now, I've talked about or mentioned Stephen King in this video, and this book is the book of Cassidy's that most reminded me of Stephen King's work. And in fact, in the afterword to the book, he does kind of compare it to a Stephen King book. He compares it to Rosemary's Baby and a Stephen King book. And I won't tell you which Stephen King book that is, because it would be a bit of a spoiler, but there's definitely something Kingish about his writing generally, and in particular in this book. And when I think about what makes King a great writer, I think two of the three things I've said about Nat Cassidy are definitely true of King. Firstly, as I've said, his prose I just find incredibly readable, and secondly, I think his characters feel really rich and really fully developed. Now, King's pacing is not always as good as Nat Cassidy's. His pacing can be fantastic. In some of his books it works really, really well, but as we all know, all of the King fans amongst us know, sometimes he gets carried away with himself and goes on these wild interludes which kind of slow the books down to a bit of a crawl. Nat Cassidy definitely doesn't suffer from that. Maybe he does in his first drafts, and he's very precise about, you know, excising all of that from the manuscript. But yeah, I think his pacing is much better than Stephen King's, certainly on the basis of what he's written so far. So yeah, as I said, I've read 4 of his books, and I would probably consider those the 4 main books, because Still the Stars is based on something else, and I definitely still want to read it, but because it's based on something else, it feels a bit less like a 100% Nat Cassidy, if that makes sense, than the other 4. But I do definitely want to read those short stories, and I will continue to read everything he writes. You know, when his next novel comes out, I will be first in line to get a copy. I really do think he's a fantastic modern horror writer, and if you haven't checked him out yet, you definitely should. So those are my thoughts on Nestlings by Nat Cassidy. Let me know if you've read it or other books by him and what you thought of them. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.